All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's get started. So today we'll be talking about process intervention, and that'll cover Chapter 7 on OD intervention strategies. Everyone has now written the quiz, and I have returned the feedback, which means you can see the grading key and what you got wrong. I didn't write out explanations this time, but please check it and let me know if you have any questions or concerns. The average for quiz 3 went up to 81%. That's an A- class average. The standard deviation fell, which means that some students who were previously earning relatively lower grades are pulling forward. So I'm simultaneously very proud of you and also wondering if it's time to make the quizzes harder. So now I'll go on to discuss process intervention. And I see it's Chapter 8 there, and I'm not sure if it's Chapter 7 or 8. It actually depends on which edition of the textbook you are using. Now, while I do not have experience as a manager in an organization, I do in fact have experience as a process intervention specialist. I used to facilitate learning process for groups of pharmacy students who were solving a medical case as part of their education. A little bit like the way Shripad guided you through that business case, except it was much less directive and the students were working together as a group in the way you see in that picture there. Now, there's a way to do process intervention that is unhelpful and pisses people off, and I've definitely been there and done that. And you can see that here in the graph showing my student satisfaction ratings. I learned a lot in those 4 years doing that work. So as you can see from where my average score fell when I started in 2012, I wasn't that good at it at first, even though I'd been trained. Delivering process interventions in an unskilled way can really frustrate people and make the group's task harder. Like there were times where my interventions were just really not helpful. I did care a lot about getting it right. And in order to do that, I had to get feedback from the group on how I was doing, which was actually not easy when there's a power difference, even a small one. People would be nice to my face and then trash me behind my back. And I was grading them on a tutorial that they had to pass to get their degree. And I would have thought, you know, that's not much of a power difference. I was officially a teaching assistant, but it still came through. And that was maybe one of my first lessons in learning about power differences and how they affect behavior, because I had expected that people would just tell me if something was wrong, but I think people had a really hard time with that. So that's how I learned that to get feedback from people who are down a power gradient, to get feedback to flow up, I had to work really hard to build a relationship with the students, which is not something you do in a day. It's something that you do, well, I saw them 3 times a week, something that you do over the course of like maybe a month or 2, where they learn that they were safe to criticize me. And I also had to learn to step back, to sit back and let them manage their own group and group process and only intervene when it was actually really necessary instead of, all the time, which made me feel like I was doing my job. With that, so on to chapter possibly 8, possibly 7, depending on which edition you're using, on process interventions. According to the textbook, which was published over 10 years ago now, organizations have developed to emphasize teams and teamwork. This means that there's a role for OD practitioners to do what they call process interventions, which are interventions into how a team works together. And in a team-based organization, managers need those skills. Process intervention skills are probably the most widely and frequently used skill set for OD practitioners. And one of those skills includes giving feedback, which I'll elaborate more on because many, if not most people, really struggle with giving and receiving feedback effectively. The team that you'll be working with as a process practitioner is a group of people who are trying to get some job done. Okay, this is a work group that is trying to achieve some collective goal that's about accomplishing some kind of a task. Okay, it's not a friend group, it's not a family group. And the important thing is that the people in the group have to work together effectively enough to get that job done to a satisfactory standard with minimal pain and inefficiency. Your role as the practitioner is to help people in the group become more aware of their behavior and of their role in the group and of how the group is working together. A lot of these processes are kind of invisible to people at a higher level. When you're sort of in it, you can't see the forest for the trees. The ultimate goal of all this is for the team to become self-managing. It's for them to learn the skills that you're modeling so that they can use them. Right? The best teacher becomes irrelevant. Process interventions focus on the way group members behave, right? On group function, on group dynamics. It doesn't focus on content. Group content refers to the work that the group is doing. That's not what this is about. When I worked as a process specialist, the college had this idea that it was better that the facilitator not be a content expert. So I don't have a pharmacy background, and they knew that, and that's what they wanted. And the idea was that this would help the facilitator focus just on process and on being a guide or a mentor or model for group process. And they didn't want us teaching the students pharmacy. That's the job of the professors. And they didn't want the students looking up to us for the answers, because then the students wouldn't be figuring out things for themselves by going through this case analysis process, which was supposed to be like the kind of situation they would encounter in the business world as pharmacists. In practice, I found that very challenging. I didn't know when to intervene with this list of prompting questions I was given because I wasn't following their discussion. It was over my head. Right? I was supposed to ask these prompting questions to make them go deeper if they had missed something, because the professors would have an idea that, oh, well, they should figure this out. They should be onto that, and they should talk about X, and they should talk about Y. But I couldn't really tell, because if they didn't use the exact words that were in my guide, if they referred to something in a different way using synonyms, then I would think they hadn't talked about it. Right? And then I'd interject unhelpfully and ask the wrong question at the wrong time. And it could be a weird experience for people. So that was a nice theory, this idea of completely separating content from process, that I thought didn't work so well in practice. I think the best process consultant understands the content and also knows how to refrain from directing and intervening and acting like the expert that the group would become dependent on for approval or for guidance. The 5 areas that the process consultant focuses on are how the group communicates, what individuals' roles are in the group and how that works, how the group solves problems and makes decisions. Then the kind of the culture of the group. All groups have their own little culture and their norms, and what we can do to develop that to be more effective, and how leadership works in the group. And we can take all these factors or areas and put them in little boxes and make them point at a circle, in case you find that visual helpful. To assess the communication patterns in the group, you can watch who talks, how much they talk. Are there some people who talk a lot and some people who speak very little? And you can look at who interrupts whom, because interrupting somebody is dominant, and there's going to be patterns of dominance and submission in the group. Be aware of them. I can't believe that I actually did this, but I actually did this. One day, I brought in a stopwatch and I timed how long everyone spoke. Then I calculated that given it was a 2-hour session, there were 9 people plus me. If everyone took an equal piece of the airtime, I calculated that they'd be speaking for 10 minutes. And I sort of put a band around that. I think it's interesting to see this as feedback. You can say, hey, look at this. You could see that there's one quiet person who took half of their fair share of airtime, and that about 35% of all the talking was 3 people talking mostly to each other. Now, this was 5 years ago, in the fullness of time, I think I was wrong in labeling people who were below the 25th or above the 75th percentile of time spoken as under or over contributing. That was something that I had learned. I had been trained as the process, say, consultant, that, you know, some people over contribute and some people under contribute. And that was something that was supposed to be on. And I was supposed to get the people who under contribute to talk more and the people who over contribute to talk less. And looking at that now, maybe that's stigmatized introverts, right? Maybe there wasn't anything wrong with that. In fact, when I showed this to folks, team member I was very insulted by all of this, and perhaps rightly so. This is a high level of scrutiny from a practitioner, and could be quite confronting as feedback. And when you look at that pattern, there's nothing to say that there's anything wrong with it. As long as the job is getting done, right, the case is getting solved, and everyone's reasonably satisfied with their experience, I don't know that it matters that there are quiet types and chatty types. That probably matters when the quiet person just isn't pulling their weight, right? When there's something that they could add that would be really valuable, but maybe they're too, they lack the confidence to say it, or something like that. Okay, maybe that's an issue you intervene in. Maybe that's when you see them looking thoughtful and you say, hey, Stephen, was there, I see you thinking, is there something you'd like to add? Okay. And maybe it's a problem if the chatty types just totally take over, and if they maybe talk about personal things that aren't what the group should be focusing on. But you can't know any of that from this airtime graph. Members take on different roles in a group, and sometimes those are assigned. So for example, in a workplace, there's usually somebody that has the job of being the team lead, and maybe there is somebody that's a secretary that will come to the meeting and they'll be the recording clerk and take the minutes. But people have their personalities and their skill sets and their preferences, and they'll naturally assume certain roles. So some people will step into leadership roles quite naturally. They're looked to as the leader, even when that isn't their formal role, right? And sometimes they can overchair or take over from the person that's supposed to be in charge. Some people will act as the challenger or the skeptic. Some people are encouraging and they will give compliments, try to make people feel better. Some people like to make peace and harmonize. Some people are, like gatekeepers, and they'll try to get things back on track when the conversation starts to stray. So you could take, take all those roles and sort them, divide them into 3 categories. There are some roles, and maybe it's more appropriate to think of these as behaviors than as roles, because the word role suggests that people only take on certain behaviors, but in reality, individuals are more flexible than that. Okay, so there are some behaviors that are about the work the group is doing, and those are doing things like making a suggestion, sharing your opinion, asking somebody else for their opinion, elaborating on what was said, checking for consensus. There's some behaviors that are about supporting the group dynamic, and those are things like giving encouragement, helping settle disagreements, inviting people to speak if you see them as thoughtful but quiet. Then there are things that people do in groups that are not functional for the group, by which I mean to say that they don't help the group achieve the task that is the shared goal and the reason for the group's being. And those are about some kind of individual needs. And common personal needs are the need to feel safe, the need to feel respected, the need to feel valued as a person. And when we feel like they're being unmet, those needs can drive us to act in ways that derail the group from achieving that common goal. I I don't love the way the textbook handles this. Right? If you look at the individual functions, they look like something to be disparaged and disregarded, right? They satisfy the individual's needs. They're not germane to the group's task and maintenance. And they're things like, seeking recognition and dominating and being the clown and making things hard for other people. Well, I would answer that groups are made up of individuals, and individuals all have psychological needs or drives, right? And those need to be recognized, managed, accommodated. I don't like the way the book insinuates that they should be abolished. So those personal needs can drive us to do things that are dysfunctional. And let's say like being really dominating in the group because maybe you have a need for control. Something I've seen is that sometimes people will derail by telling a lot of personal stories. And that might mean that they want to be cared about. They want more intimacy. I lost my clicker. Oh, there it is. So something that you can do when you're training a group is associate certain behaviors, which represent skill sets, and then assign those behaviors to roles and then rotate the roles intentionally. So everyone gets a chance to try these on. So maybe everyone gets a turn to chair the meeting, and that's how they develop their leadership skills. Maybe everyone gets a turn to be the encourager, and that's how they learn to motivate others. And maybe everyone gets a turn to be the skeptic and challenge the group. And one of the reasons that the college that I worked for had this practice of rotating roles was because groups need a skeptic. If you've taken intro psychology, which of course you have because you're in fourth year psychology, you would have heard about groupthink, that when people work together in a group and they really get along, they actually make worse decisions because people just agree with each other and like, yeah, that's great. So that energizer function is one function in a group, but you also need the skeptic and the challenger who's like, hey, wait a minute. But people can feel really uncomfortable doing that, especially if they're agreeable people. This comes quite naturally to disagreeable people. And they might not take on that role unless they have to. But doing so helps them develop those skills, which actually are important to a well-functioning group. And these are examples of the role cards I used. The college had nicer ones, but they got all frayed. And then I ended up making my own and laminating them. So they were laminated index card. And everyone's role would go up on a flip chart. And so people knew that everyone was trying to do a role. So one day it would say, Jeff is the chair and Lucy is the encourager and Bill is the skeptic. And every day those got moved around. And that helped, I think that made it easier to do because, if Lucy is awkwardly asking skeptical questions, well, everyone knows that she's the skeptic today. So you can see that 5 years ago, I believed in positive energy and negative energy. I've come so far since then. And then one of the cards was the active participant role. And that's when they got to be themselves in an engaged way. So going back to this issue of individual functions. So those roles we discussed are all things you're supposed to do. And then there's things can be a bit problematic. And we need to manage around that too. So what can we do? I find the book just has an attitude about this individual need bit that's kind of disparaging and dismissive to those functions, which isn't helpful. It doesn't tell you what to do about that, and you will need to do about that, right? What's your skill in managing it? So if you have somebody in a group who has some dysfunctional behavior, and behind all that, there's some unmet need, being contemptuous about it isn't going to make anything better welcome. In fact, it can lead to more dysfunction, right? Like, let's say that you would be kind of nasty about it. Well, what's that going to get you? So what you need to do is find some healthy, some adaptive way to meet those needs. And in a feedback or counseling intervention with an individual, you might need to make somebody aware that the way they're doing something in a group is problematic, but then you also need to give them next steps that are an adaptive way forward. Something that I've done is use icebreaker questions to help people get to know each other a little. And those can be useful with a new group. I think Howard Burroughs, who wrote about process interventions in education, I think put his finger on it when he talked about the importance of people kind of knowing each other. He wrote, in a small working group, it's essential that each person has an opportunity to establish who they are and their own importance as an individual with unique and important things to offer by virtue of particular interests and backgrounds. We like to feel important. We have a need for strangers with whom we're going to be working intimately and intensively to know about us. And in fact, if each member does not have a chance to identify their own importance as an individual, we'll often do this later through behavior and comments that can interfere with the group process. So I felt that icebreaker questions were a way to manage around that. And they also gave me some more control, because sometimes when people were looking for personal validation and they were telling personal stories, they might tell a story that, say, could be triggering. I don't know what. I didn't have any control over that, but I have control over the icebreaker question. Right? Do you have a pet? And that helped me manage things from, I know, going sideways. So another area of focus for the practitioner is how the group makes decisions. Maybe the leader makes the decisions and everyone else goes along with it. That's what they do in organization B. When there actually is one right decision, that can be efficient and adaptive. Then there's majority vote, and that's much more democratic, but it does mean that some people will be unhappy and they'll get sidelined. And that is a problem if you need to have them on board. Let's say you need everyone to be involved in implementing the change. And if there's some people who didn't feel included in the decision, then they might not want to bend over backwards to help you implement it. The ideal, which is what they do in organization A, is consensus. And that actually doesn't mean that everyone gets exactly what they want. It means that everyone has a voice and they can talk about things, and maybe there'll be some adjustments. And at the end of the day, everyone's okay with the decision and they're ready to invest in it. Another one of those 5 areas that we mentioned is group norms and growth. So groups, there's going to be a larger organizational culture, but within that, there's going to be subcultures, and groups have their little subcultures. And you can help them become aware of it, right? And how that affects decision-making and how they can develop a culture that is more effective given their goals. The last of those 5 areas of focus for the practitioner was leadership and authority. People are often unaware of power dynamics, even when those are playing out right in front of them. And you as the practitioner can help them become aware of that, right? Just the way, like the way that I taught you guys about what dominant and submissive behavior looks like. There will be a formal leader. Usually the workplace has appointed some person to be the team lead, but that person may or may not be respected as a leader. Sometimes other personalities, say people with disagreeable or dominant traits, will step forward naturally and they'll become informal leaders. So you probably have an informal leader, and maybe there might be another 2 who are informal leaders. When you are training a group, you may be able to rotate that chair role, as I did, so that everyone gets to take a turn at developing their leadership skills. Now, let's go over what these interventions are. So remember that an intervention is the specific thing that you do, right? They're the things that you do to ideally, helpfully intervene in the group process. These are not about group content, which is a specific work that the group does together. They're about how the group works together. And in performing these interventions, you model a skill to the group, and the group members learn how to do that themselves so that ultimately down the road, they're a self-managing team. So one thing you can do is summarize what you've heard, right? And then check back to see if your understanding was valid. That practice of checking back shows that you care, that you're listening. It affirms that you're trying to understand and communicate well. It's when we assume that we understand that we can be arrogant and ignorant. You can synthesize, which means putting several points together to form a theme. And I did that with that psychological contract activity. So with that activity, you guys got into your groups, and then you all came up with points, and I wrote them down on the board, and I listened to all those different points, and I had to pull them together somehow into a few main points that gave me direction going forward. And that's always going to be a bit of an art over science, and you need to be aware that you could distort that information some way. And if you have a bias, you might want to take that data in a certain direction. Those are things to be aware of. And there's generalization. Sometimes in a group, one person will say something, and then we assume that that's what the whole group believes, but it's really just what one person said. So when everyone actually does agree with that idea, then that person effectively does speak for the group. But you want to check for ideally disagreement. If you say something like, does everyone agree? People, I don't know, have a naturally tendency to go along with things. And so saying who disagrees is a way to pull up disagreement. And sometimes people say no, and that's just fine. If the conversation seems vague or superficial, or people are kind of rushing ahead without giving things an appropriate depth of thought, and I will add, how will you know what is an appropriate depth of thought if you don't understand the content? But anyway, that's when you would ask probing questions to get people to go deeper. So saying, what did you mean by that? Could you explain in more detail? Then there's listening. That's a process intervention. And listening is something you can model. And you want to listen to what people are saying verbally and what they're saying non-verbally, because often there's some disparity there. People often say one thing and mean another. And you have to notice that inconsistency between what they say and how they act. Like, for instance, people might say they agree or they like something, but there's some kind of tension in their body. Right? You might hear it in their tone of voice. Empathy is about being able to take someone else's perspective and see what they see and feel what they feel. And you can communicate your empathy. You need to communicate it because you have empathy. How is anyone else going to know if you don't say anything about it? So you can communicate your empathy by reflecting back what you think the speaker is feeling. I was a big fan of Star Trek, the original series. And when it was over, I was sad but happy that there was another series called Next Generation. Have you seen that? Way before your time. And they had this character who just drove me so batshit crazy I couldn't watch the show anymore. But so on Star Trek, the original series, there's a bunch of people on the bridge who are running this spaceship. But in this second series, they put a counselor, like a psychologist, on the bridge. And when there was some like angry alien who was yelling at the captain, she'd sort of be like, "Captain, I sense anger." And it was incredibly irritating. So what she's modeling there is reflecting feelings, but I suppose one can do that unhelpfully. Something else that a process specialist does is provide emotional support, coaching, and counseling. You want to make the people in the group feel hopeful and optimistic about what they're doing, about the group and their role in it. There is a lot of value in praising the group for things that they're doing well. That can be very energizing. And you can stress them out by being critical. Not that you should never be critical, but be aware that it does kind of take energy away from people. And if you do a lot of that, it'll leave people feeling like that. Coaching and counseling are interventions that you will probably perform with individual group members in private. You can do it at a group level. Providing coaching to an entire group might look like encouraging them and supporting them to do something that they're hesitant to do. And an example I'll give you is that I was supposed to get people to go up to the board and use the whiteboard markers to draw out anatomy and chemical reactions. So to use drawing as a learning style. And people don't want to do that. So I had to do a lot of coaching and be like, but listen, and I'd say, oh, and can you draw a diagram of that? And yeah, great job. So I was coaching them on that. What is the difference between coaching and counseling? I hear you ask. So coaching is about helping somebody work to a specific actionable goal. Like let's say that one day they want to lead the group discussion and they need coaching on their facilitation skills, the practical things. So you might say to that person, oh, well, it's okay for you to just initiate the discussion, and maybe when you speak, you want to use a tone of authority and some vocal fry. Okay, that would be coaching. It's very practical. Okay. Counseling is a bit more abstract, more philosophical, more existential, and it's more about the big questions like meaning and purpose. Like, why are you afraid of conflict? And why don't you think you're a good leader? Sometimes people are frustrated about their group dynamic. I mean, if they've asked you to come in as a consultant, there must be something wrong. And they might want to vent about it. And maybe there's somebody in the group that really pisses them off and they want to vent about that. And it's probably better that they vent that to you than fly off the handle in the group and embarrass that person. So your role there would be to help them figure out how to express this need, how to deal with the situation constructively. Counseling always has a focus on what's the next action. So a person has a problem, okay, you talk about it, look at it from different perspectives, and then that needs to lead to action. So what are we going to do about it? That's adaptive, right? You want an adaptive response that gets the person to their goal. Often it can come down to something like asserting a boundary, which can actually be hard for people. People can sit with feelings for a really long time, angry feelings, and not know what to do about it, and it just eats them away inside. But really in practice, if they just said something even small, people might be very understanding and willing to make a change. When you give individual group members personalized feedback, and I'll come back to that, you should be prepared to give them some counseling around how to move forward with that feedback. Otherwise, what is the feedback for? So on to providing feedback. This is actually not easy, and many people really struggle with both receiving and giving feedback. They're sort of scared to receive it, and they're scared to give it. And the way that you do this can be helpful or harmful, and your job is to help. So we want to be constructive. Many people think of feedback as coming in two flavors, positive and negative. And the way they think about that is that positive feedback is feedback that makes you feel good about yourself. and that you should be happy about receiving, and that negative feedback is feedback that makes you feel bad about yourself and that you should be devastated to receive. And it's not adaptive to think like that at all, okay? So our behaviors help us achieve, or they get in the way of achieving a certain goal in a certain context, and different people can assess that in different ways. So we can at best help people understand what's working, what they should keep doing, it's going to help them get to their goal. And then we can also give people helpful tips on what else they could be doing, or what they could be doing that's different to reach their goal more efficiently or effectively. And if you see that somebody is going in a direction that's not helpful, they're going to go off a cliff, then maybe the nice thing to do is actually help them see that and change course. Good quality feedback is specific. If you say, "Great job" to somebody, well, what the hell does that mean? What are they doing that you like, that is helpful? Why is it helpful? In what context is helpful, given what kind of goal you're trying to achieve? Okay. And if you tell somebody, well, you know, you suck, that, well, what, why, how? So it needs to be specific. It needs to be actionable. Like, it should lead to them making a change or knowing that they should keep doing something in a certain context. And then it needs to be respectful. And what do I mean by respectful? There's a way to give people feedback that would suck all the energy out of them, and be aware of your ability to do that. So you're going to need to balance. So let's say that the affirmative feedback, which people think is positive feedback, they like that, gives them an energy boost. Okay. And then let's say people find that the constructive feedback can make them, I don't know, can take some energy away. Be aware of that balance, okay? And don't just kind of leave a person wrecked. That is not respectful of the person. It's probably not respectful to label a person as, let's say, a bad employee or a toxic employee, to say things like "you always" and "you never," because people are super adaptable and they have this ability to pivot and change and recreate themselves. You can get in the way of by imposing boxes and labels that make them think of themselves in a certain way of doing a certain thing. So honor their ability to change. A big hindrance to receiving feedback generally, to this matter of fragility to feedback, is that many people have conditional self-worth. That's also known as contingent self-esteem. So your self-esteem is what you think you're worth. And is low self-esteem bad and high self-esteem good? I don't know. But what we do know from the research, and there's plenty of research that points to this, is that the performances we engage in, the behaviors that we engage in, if we are pursuing high self-esteem, right, if we're trying to make ourselves feel good about ourselves, that tends to make us do things that are actually maladaptive. So let's say that you associate your self-worth with your appearance. Well, that's going to drive you to, I don't know, spend a lot of money on plastic surgery and clothes shopping, and putting filters on your pictures, and taking selfies. And this is all kind of a dark path, right? It's not going to make you actually feel better about yourself in the long run. You're always going to be fragile, and you see pictures and you go looking for yourself, and you'll see your profile and you'll think, oh no, you see, it doesn't go anywhere good. And it takes your focus off the actual performance and the achievement of goals, which in a work group, what people need to be focusing on. So many, if not most people, have a sense of conditional self-worth, and they feel that their worth is conditional. It depends on their good performances or some kind of form of external validation. And if they get a bad performance assessment, they think, I am a bad person. If they get a low grade, they think, I'm a bad student. And well, somebody's self-worth is really important to them, right? So they're going to defend that. And then they'd have to kind of defend against or deny the performance assessment. One thing that I see a lot of in students is self-undermining. So students might feel that a bad grade means I'm a bad student, which means I have low academic or intellectual ability, and toxic academic culture is super ableist, and it associates your worth with your intellectual ability. So we make that kind of complex equivalency. And now a low grade is really, really threatening. And so what some students will do is they'll just not submit something. Okay, so if you take zeros on everything, you'll get an F, but you can tell yourself, well, that's because I didn't do it. If you procrastinate, and let's say you give yourself a really small amount of time to do the work, if you get a low grade, well, then you can say, it's because I did it in one night. Okay, you're kind of giving yourself reasons that the low grade actually isn't about your low ability, because then you don't have to make that connection between ability and self-worth. Okay, so I see self-undermining. The opposite of that is if you get a good performance assessment and you think, I am a good and worthy person. Well, is that a good thing? Not really. Okay, it leads people to be kind of superior and stuck up, and to feel entitled to getting praise. And that's not adaptive either. And then you get these situations where people think that they must always have positive feedback that feels good, and they cannot get negative feedback that feels bad. And it's just a hot mess. If you really believe in equality, and equality is supposed to be one of the values of OD, okay, let's go with that. Then you have to believe that each person is valuable in their own right, in their own way, and equally so, and that their worth is a given. That's something to be taken for granted, that there are no hierarchies in the worth of people. So self-esteem as self-worth is a measure of the value of a person. And the games we play when we pursue self-esteem are about convincing ourselves and convincing other people that we meet some standard for having worth. And the application of whatever standard lies behind that judgment assumes that some people are worth more or less than others for some reason. If you're going to be a critical thinker, you might ask, but what's a good reason? What is a good measure of the worth of a human being? And there's none that aren't problematic. So if you were to value people on the basis of productivity, well, then you're saying that people are worth what they produce, and that people who produce less are worth less. And that line of thinking has very sad implications for people who have disabilities, or people who encounter barriers, who are not privileged and supported in every way that they may be at peak performance and achieve all these things. Valuing people on the basis of social status or on the basis of money assumes implicitly that the poor and the powerless are worth less. And so we have classism. Valuing people on the basis of sex or race is simply sexism and racism. Valuing people on the basis of the approval of others would marginalize anyone who's unconventional, anyone who challenges the status quo. And we know that we need those people. There is no standard that is just. And even if there was one, it wouldn't be justly applied. Because in psychology, we've learned about all these cognitive biases that lead us into misjudgments, like over-attributing people's behavior to their personal traits, their failure to accept personal responsibility for their behavior over the situational factors. So there is no just standard. Even if there was one, probably couldn't apply it justly. So the textbook mentions setting the agenda as something that OD practitioners do. That doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. It doesn't mean that you help the group come up with their meeting agenda. In this context, it means that you help the group set aside time to talk about the group process itself, right? To talk to each other about the team dynamic and to cultivate that awareness. And I would do that as per the college's process and standards in a 10-minute debrief session. That was the end of every meeting. And every session, the debrief facilitator role would rotate. And the facilitator would ask people, well, what worked well? Right? What went well about the session today? Right? What did we like? And is there anything that we might want to do differently next time? And that creates space for the awareness of group dynamics that are otherwise be invisible to us. Now, the practitioner, or the manager in this case, isn't supposed to be directive. That's not what process interventions are about. The practitioner is supposed to step back and let the group self-manage. That said, as the practitioner, you might be asked to provide advice on how to do things. And you need to be very cautious about how you respond to this, because it's not consistent with the goals of a process practitioner to tell people what to do. Suggesting and directing aren't the same thing, right? It says make structural suggestions. But when there's an actual or perceived power difference, right? When your boss is making a suggestion, that kind of comes across as an order. Managers will be directive because it's their job, but micromanaging might not be good for them either. Ideally, the manager or the practitioner avoids stepping in and taking over, but the practical exigencies of the workplace say that a manager will totally step in and take over when they see something they don't like. So maybe there's a difference between the ideals of this discipline and what happens on the ground. Finally, so this is the last of the process interventions. You'll have the role of being a model for constructive interpersonal behavior. So the process interventions that you use are skills that the group members pick up on through observational learning. And that should help them develop towards being able to manage their own group dynamics. They'll start mimicking these things after they see you do it. Process interventions are widely used by OD practitioners, and they are heralded on the basis of practitioner knowledge. We think they work. We passionately believe they work. According to your textbook, there is little empirical evidence that they're beneficial. And now the book was published in 2011, so I did a quick Google Scholar search, and I didn't see anything new. The fact that there's no evidence for something doesn't mean that it doesn't work. There's a saying about this. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. It could mean that nobody has done the study. Nobody has published that study. I don't even know how you'd empirically study that. Like, it sounds pretty complicated. And maybe that could be your honors thesis. So, they are nevertheless believed in, relied upon, and widely practiced, and increasingly used by managers as we move towards organizations that are more team-focused. Are there any questions or comments? There's most people are on Zoom, so I'll give them a minute. Okay, so our next class will be on Tuesday. I will email you when I have posted the quiz. I have it half written, so that should be soon. And with that, I will turn off the recording and make myself available for any off-the-record questions.